Reach into your pocket and find a coin. Look at the face stamped on it. That face is doing something strange. It is asking you to accept a disc of metal as a promise. Around 630 BC, in a kingdom called Lydia, somebody tried that for the very first time. And here is the part nobody tells you. It did not work properly. Because the first coins in human history were not gold. They were struck from a metal whose gold content swung anywhere from 40% to 80%. Coin to coin, from the same river. Which means the first money ever minted had a defect welded into it. Nobody could tell what a coin was worth by looking at it, not the merchant, not the king, not the man being paid. In the next half hour, you get the mechanics, not a museum tour, why the coin was invented, what was broken about it, and how one king fixed it so completely, his fix ran the world for 25 centuries. And by the end, you will spot the exact same defect in things people are still buying today. Start with the place, because the geography is doing more work in this story than any king. Lydia sat in western Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. Its capital was Sardis. It was not the largest kingdom of the ancient world, and it was never the strongest army in the region. What Lydia had instead was position. It sat on the hinge between the wealthy Greek cities strung along the Aegean coast and the long overland trade roads running east into Mesopotamia and beyond. Almost everything moving between those two worlds passed through Lydian territory and paid for the privilege. And when everything passes through your hands, you eventually stop being a producer of goods and become something far more profitable. A middleman, a market, a place where other people's business gets settled, weighed, and taxed on its way through. Through Sardis ran a small river called the Pactolus. The legend says King Midas washed his golden touch away in that stream, and that the gold he shed settled into the riverbed and stayed there. That is legend. I am telling you now so you can hold it as legend, not history. The geology underneath the legend, though, is entirely real. The Pactolus carried grains of a pale, yellowish metal down from the slopes of Mount Tmolus, and the people of Lydia had been collecting it out of the sand and gravel for generations before anyone thought to stamp it. And that detail matters more than it looks. They did not have to mine it, crush ore, or smelt anything. The river had already done the extraction. Lydia's advantage was not that it was rich in gold. Plenty of places were. It was that its gold arrived pre-separated from the rock in usable grains for free. That metal is called electrum. And a crucial thing to understand is that electrum is not gold that a smith has mixed with silver. It is a natural alloy. Gold and silver already combined in the ground, with small traces of copper, tin, lead, and iron carried along with them. It looks like gold that has gone slightly pale, slightly washed out. Some ancient writers called it white gold. And here is the property that drives this entire episode. The ratio of gold to silver inside it was decided by geology millions of years before anyone arrived to pick it up. Now, before we go any further, I need to kill an assumption that ruins most versions of this story. People did not invent money in Lydia. Money already existed. It had existed in recognizable form for thousands of years before a Lydian ever struck a lump of metal. Mesopotamian merchants had been settling debts in weighed silver long before Lydia existed as a kingdom. Egyptians priced goods against copper weights. The clay ledgers of Uruk were tracking who owed what to whom centuries before anybody thought about coins at all. So what existed before Lydia was weighed metal. What did not exist was coined metal. In the entire distance between those two ideas, weighed and coined is the subject of this episode. Get that distinction and everything afterwards falls into place. Here is how a transaction actually worked in the weighed metal world. A merchant wants to buy a quantity of grain. He brings silver. Sometimes a cast bar, sometimes a lump, very often a broken piece of jewelry that archaeologists call hack silver, chopped up specifically to be spent. Out come the scales. Out come the standard weights, which each city guarded jealously because the weights were the standard. The silver goes on one pan, the weights on the other, and two grown men stand in a market arguing about a balance beam. Then comes the second argument, and it is the one that never fully resolves. The scale tells you how much metal is present. It tells you absolutely nothing about how good that metal is. Silver cut with copper still weighs the same and still looks, to the ordinary eye, like silver. So every serious transaction in the ancient world carried a hidden cost that had nothing to do with the price of the goods being sold. It was the cost of finding out whether the person in front of you was cheating. Economists have a clean name for this: verification cost. And in the ancient world, verification was slow, expensive, required a specialist, and even then was never entirely conclusive. It was a tax on every exchange, paid in time and suspicion. You could rub the metal on a touchstone and read the color of the streak against known samples. You could weigh it in water to check its density. In the last resort, you could cut it open and look. Each of those took skill, took time, and the last one damaged the very thing you were trying to trade. And notice who actually pays that cost. Not the cheat. The cheat has already been paid and left. It is the honest trader who pays over and over in caution and delay on every transaction he ever makes, including all the ones where the metal in front of him was perfectly good. Which meant that for ordinary daily commerce, a loaf, a jug of oil, a day of a laborer's work, weighed precious metal was almost useless. Nobody essays a lump of silver to buy lunch. The verification cost is larger than the transaction. So ordinary people mostly did not use precious metal at all. They used credit, barter, tallies, obligation, and the long memory of neighbors who would see each other again next week. Weighed silver was for the big deals between people who owned scales and could afford to wait. Now take that world and drop electrum into it and watch the problem get considerably worse rather than better, because electrum introduces an uncertainty that silver never had. Electrum's gold content is natural, which means it varies from deposit to deposit and even within a deposit. Across the sources of Western Anatolia, the gold fraction in electrum runs roughly from 40% at the low end up to around 80% at the high end. And gold, then as now, was worth many times more than silver. So two electrum pieces of identical weight sitting side by side on the same table could differ enormously in what they were actually worth. Not slightly. By a factor that could ruin you. Worse than that, and this is the cruel part, you cannot see the difference. 40% gold and 70% gold look very nearly identical. The shift in color is subtle enough that only a practiced specialist in good light would even think to question it. So here is the position the Lydians were sitting in. They had a metal that was abundant, that came out of their own river ready to use, that every trading partner in the known world wanted, and that absolutely nobody could price with confidence. Think for a moment about what that does to a market. If I cannot verify your metal, I do not pay you what it is probably worth. I pay you what it would be worth if it turned out to be the worst version I have ever seen. That is the only safe move. Every buyer assumes the worst case, which means every honest holder of genuinely good electrum is systematically underpaid. And so, quite rationally, honest holders of good electrum stop bringing it to market at all and spend the bad pieces instead. That is not a moral failure of ancient people. It is a mechanical property of markets where quality cannot be checked. Bad goods drive out good goods. The average quality on offer falls, buyers discount further, and the market thins out until it barely functions at all. And the losses here are not dramatic, which is exactly why they go unnoticed. There is no crisis, no collapse, no moment anyone can point to. There is just a slow, permanent tax on everything, and a long list of exchanges that would have made both people better off and simply never happened. And that is the real problem waiting to be solved in Sardis in the 7th century BC. Not a shortage of metal, they were swimming in metal. A shortage of trust in what the metal was. Which brings us to the actual invention. Because what the Lydians invented was not a piece of metal. Everyone in the ancient world already had pieces of metal. What they invented was a mechanism for making a complete stranger believe a number. Somewhere in the second half of the 7th century BC, call it 600 to 600 BC, because the precise dating is still argued over by people who have spent careers on it. Somebody in Lydia took a weighed lump of electrum, set it on an anvil, and drove a punch into it with a hammer. That is all a coin is at the beginning. A lump of controlled weight with a mark driven into its surface. The earliest pieces are so crude that if you found one in a field today, without context, you would not call it a coin. You would call it a blob with a dent. We know what they looked like because of an excavation, not because of a text. In 1904 and 1905, the British Museum dug at the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus and found a foundation deposit sealed underneath the archaic temple. That word sealed is doing a lot of work. A sealed foundation deposit means the objects went into the ground together deliberately at one moment and nobody disturbed them afterwards. For dating purposes, that is close to a laboratory condition. And inside it were early electrum pieces. Some are blank lumps carrying nothing but a punch mark on one side, others carry symbols, the badges of whoever was standing behind them. They are not all the same thing, and the differences are the story. Because the sequence inside that deposit reads like a technology developing in real time. First, plain weighed lumps with a punch, then lumps carrying a symbol, then finally, properly struck designs with a recognizable image on the face. The design that matters most is a lion's head. The lion was the emblem of the Mermnad dynasty, and the coins bearing it were struck in the reign of King Alyattes, the fourth Mermnad king, who ruled from roughly 619 to 560 BC. Now hold on to what that lion actually is, because this is the hinge of the whole episode, and almost every retelling of it gets lost, admiring the craftsmanship instead. The lion is not decoration. The lion is a signature. The mark is a statement, and the statement is this: the king of Lydia stands behind this piece of metal, not behind its beauty, behind its weight and its content. If it is wrong, you know precisely whose door to go to, and he is not difficult to find. That is the invention, not metal as money, metal plus a public guarantee, issued by an authority that cannot easily deny having issued it, and that has to live in the same city as the people it just sold something to. And notice exactly what that does to the verification cost, because it is subtler than people assume. It does not reduce the cost of verifying metal. Assaying is just as hard as it ever was. What it does is move the cost, and move it once. Instead of every merchant in every single transaction testing every lump that comes across the table, the testing is done one time, at the mint, by the issuer. Everybody downstream has to do only one thing: recognize a lion. There is a second mark worth mentioning, on the back. Early coins carry a rough incuse punch on the reverse, the impression of the tool that held the blank while the front was struck. It is not a design. It is a manufacturing scar, and it is one of the ways specialists still identify genuinely early pieces. Recognizing a lion is free. It takes no skill, no equipment, and no time. Assaying is none of those things. That single substitution, one expensive check at the source instead of endless cheap but inadequate checks at every hop, is why coinage swept the ancient world in under 2 centuries. The Lydians also did the other half of the job, and it is the half that usually goes unmentioned. They standardized the weights, and then they issued fractions of the main unit, which is a far less obvious decision than it sounds. There was a full unit, the stater, and beneath it a ladder of denominations, a third of a stater called a trite, and smaller pieces below that down to a 12th, and further still, a system, not a coin. We can be precise about the trite, because specimens survive in collections and have been physically weighed. A Lydian lion trite comes in at about 4.71 grams, roughly 13 by 10 by 4 millimeters. That is small enough to disappear entirely inside your closed hand. 3 of those make up the full stater, so the top denomination is a serious piece of metal representing serious value, while the small change is genuinely small, both in size and in what it buys. And the fractions are the part almost everyone skips past. A large coin serves large merchants doing large deals, people who already had scales and specialists and were managing fine. Fractions are what let coined money reach a market stall, a laborer, a single day's wage. There is also a quiet advantage in this for the issuer, and it never goes away. If people accept your coin at its stamped value rather than its raw metal value, the difference belongs to you. Every state that has ever minted money has understood this, and the temptation it creates runs through the rest of this entire series. Which is the difference between a settlement instrument for the wealthy and money, in the sense you and I mean the word. Lydia built the second thing. That is why we still talk about it. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, so roughly 200 years after the events, working from what the Lydians of his own day told him, gives us the ancient world's own verdict on all this. He says, and I am quoting him directly here, they were the first people to introduce the use of gold and silver coins, and the first who sold goods by retail. Read that second clause again, because it gets skipped every single time, and it is arguably the more important half of the sentence. The first who sold goods by retail. Herodotus is not only crediting them with the coin, he is crediting them with the shop, with the idea that goods can sit out in the open, priced in advance, waiting for whoever happens to walk past, instead of every exchange being a negotiation between two men who already know each other's reputation. And those two inventions are not two inventions. They are the same one, seen from two ends. You cannot run a retail stall on weighed metal because you cannot stop to assay every customer's lump while a queue forms. Retail requires a coin. The coin makes the shop possible. From Sardis, the idea crossed almost immediately to the Greek cities strung along the Ionian coast. Ephesus, Miletus, Phocaea, places that were trading with Lydia every single day and could see exactly what it was doing for Lydian commerce. And each of those cities struck its own types, carrying its own civic badge. A seal for Phocaea, a bee for Ephesus. Different animal, identical logic. This is who stands behind this piece, and this is the reputation you are relying on. Which is the moment coinage becomes political, permanently. To issue coinage is to make a public claim that your word is good, stamped into metal, and then sent out to travel through other people's hands into cities where nobody has ever met you. And it is the cheapest advertising any state has ever bought. Your badge in the hand of every merchant and every port your traders reach, being examined carefully by people who have never heard your name. Within roughly 2 centuries, coined money had spread across the Greek world, into the Persian Empire, and outward from there along every route those two touched. Measured against the pace of technological change in the ancient world, that is extraordinarily fast. It spread that fast for 2 unglamorous reasons. It solved a genuine, daily, expensive problem for ordinary traders. And it was cheap to copy. You need metal, a pair of dies, a hammer, and a reputation worth trusting. But, and here is where this episode turns. The reputation could only carry so much of the load, because the metal underneath the stamp was still electrum, with everything that implied. The lion could promise you the weight, and it could promise you that the king's people had checked the piece. What the lion could not possibly do was turn 40% gold into 70% gold. The stamp covered the uncertainty. It did not remove it. So even a properly struck, officially issued electrum coin was still a promise about a fundamentally variable substance. Inside Lydia that worked, because everyone locally accepted the king's stated rate as a matter of convention and had no better option. Take that same coin abroad, though, and a foreign merchant is very nearly back where he started. He does not particularly trust your lion, he has no recourse against your king, and he still cannot see the gold content. The problem had been contained, not cured. So the last move in this story belongs to the man whose name became a synonym for wealth in half the languages of Europe. Aliati's son, Croesus. We remember Croesus for being rich. Rich as Croesus, people still say. 26 centuries later, usually without any idea who he was, what he deserves to be remembered for is not his treasury. It is a metallurgical decision. Croesus looked at electrum and reached a conclusion that his father had not. The problem could not be stamped away, no matter how good the stamp or how feared the king behind it. The uncertainty was inside the metal, so the metal had to be taken apart. So he built workshops at Sardis, whose entire purpose was to split electrum into its components, to separate a natural alloy into pure gold on one side and pure silver on the other at industrial scale. And this is not a claim resting on an ancient text that may or may not be reliable. It rests on the ground. Archaeologists working at Sardis found the remains of an ancient gold refining installation near the Pactolus stream, the same stream the raw electrum came out of. The technique is called cementation. You take the alloy and hammer it into thin sheets because the process works on surfaces and thin metal is nearly all surface. Then you pack those sheets with salt inside a sealed vessel and you hold the whole thing at heat for a long time. The salt attacks the silver, converting it into a chloride, which is absorbed into the packing material and drawn out of the alloy. What is left behind in the vessel is gold, and the longer you hold the heat, the purer that remaining gold becomes. It is slow. It is enormously fuel hungry, which in the ancient world means charcoal, which means forests. It demands workers who know exactly what they are doing, and it only makes sense if you have enough material flowing through to justify building the installation at all. Which is exactly why this is a state project and could not have been anything else. No individual workshop refines electrum at scale as a sideline. This required a king, a revenue stream, and a reason. And out of those workshops came something the world had genuinely never seen before: coins of gold and coins of silver, each struck to a deliberate and consistent purity that the issuer controlled rather than inherited from a riverbed. They are called crosides, struck around 550 BC, carrying the confronted foreparts of a lion and a bull facing each other across the face of the coin. The lion is still there, which is not an accident. Croesus had changed the metal completely, and he kept his father's animal on the front of it. Continuity of the guarantee mattered more than novelty. The people using these coins needed to see that the same authority was still standing behind them. Now look carefully at what that actually achieves, because it is considerably bigger than simply a nicer coin, and this is the part worth the whole episode. Before Croesus, one metal, uncertain content, value permanently estimated, every foreign transaction reopening the same argument. After Croesus, two metals, each of known and controlled purity, each a fixed quantity of a known substance, and an official rate published between them. The ancient sources indicate one gold stater exchanging against 10 silver staters. That is a state declaring an exchange rate between two monetary metals, which is, arguably, the first monetary policy in recorded human history. A bimetallic system also does something an electrum system structurally could not. Gold handles the large transactions, where you need value to be dense and portable. Silver handles everyday commerce, where you need denominations small enough to be spendable. Two tiers, one system, a fixed bridge between them. For the first time, a merchant in Miletus or Babylon or anywhere else could hold a Lydian coin and know precisely what he was holding. And crucially, not because he trusted the king who issued it, but because the metal itself no longer concealed anything from him. That is the true end of the story that began with a lump of pale metal in a riverbed. The defect was not patched over, disclosed, or insured against. It was removed at the source. And that is a categorically different kind of fix. And then, within a very few years of achieving all of it, Croesus lost his kingdom entirely. Around 546 BC, and scholars still argue between 547 and 546, so treat the date as approximate. The armies of Cyrus the Great took Sardis, and Lydia stopped existing as an independent kingdom, permanently. What happened to Croesus personally, the ancient sources flatly disagree about. Herodotus has him spared and retained as an advisor. The poet Bacchylides has him on a burning pyre. Nobody alive can tell you which is true, and you should be a little suspicious of anyone who says they can. There is an irony here that is hard to miss. The refined gold that made Croesus the byword for wealth was also, in the end, a very good reason to come and take Sardis. A kingdom that has solved the problem of making value portable and verifiable has also made it extremely convenient to carry away. But the fate of the man is genuinely not the point of this episode. Watch what happened to the invention instead, because that is where the real answer is. Because the Persians did not abolish Lydian coinage when they took Sardis. They did not replace it, suppress it, or ignore it. They adopted it. The Persian daric, the gold coin that would go on to pay armies, fund construction, and buy the loyalty of Greek politicians for the better part of 2 centuries, is built directly on the system Croesus had just finished building at Sardis. Cyrus conquered the mint and then kept the method. That is close to the highest compliment one empire ever pays another, and it tells you the system was not a Lydian curiosity. It was simply better, and everybody who encountered it could see that. From Persia, the pattern moved outward into the Greek world through the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander, and eventually into Rome, where the next episode of this series will pick the story up. and every single one of those systems inherited the same underlying architecture, a metal of known purity, issued in standard weights, subdivided into usable fractions, and carrying the mark of an authority that can be held responsible for it. Which means the thing actually invented in Lydia was never really the coin. It was the template. Metal, plus purity, plus standard weight, plus a name that can be blamed. 4 components, and every monetary system since has been some arrangement of them. Take away any one of those 4, and the system degrades in a predictable way. Take away the last one, the name that can be held responsible, and you are standing back at the riverbed holding something pale and yellow that might be worth a great deal or might be worth very little. 26 centuries later, that is still the entire game. Every currency, every asset, every financial instrument sits somewhere on the spectrum between a fully refined crocide and an unassayed lump of electrum, and the position is rarely advertised. And most of the genuine disasters in monetary history happen for one reason. People believed they were holding the first thing and discovered, always at the worst possible moment, that they were holding the second. So what do you actually take away from a kingdom that fell 26 centuries ago? 4 things, and every one of them still works today. 1. Value and verifiability are 2 completely different properties, and confusing them is expensive. Electrum was genuinely valuable and practically untradeable at the same time. If you cannot cheaply prove what something is, the market will price it as though it were the worst possible version of itself, and the market is being rational when it does that. 2. Whenever you see a stamp, a seal, a rating, or a certification, ask the only question that actually matters. Who specifically is standing behind this, and what happens to them if it turns out to be wrong? A mark from someone who bears no cost for being wrong is decoration. Aleatti's lion worked because everyone knew where the king lived. 3. Fractions decide who a system is really for. Lydia's coinage changed the world because it went small enough to buy a day's bread, not because it went large enough to settle a royal debt. Any financial product that only functions at large sizes is, by design, not built for most people. Check the minimum before you check the returns. 4. The strongest fix is the one that removes the uncertainty rather than the one that manages it. Aleatti stamped the problem and made it workable. Croesus refined it out and made it disappear. Both were real improvements. Only one of them was a solution, and knowing which kind you are being offered is most of financial literacy. Here is the single sentence I would keep from all of this. A coin is not a piece of metal. A coin is a piece of metal that somebody has agreed to be blamed for. And everything that came afterwards, the denarius, the banknote, the gold standard, the digital ledger, is one long argument about who that somebody ought to be and how far they can be trusted. That argument turns violent surprisingly quickly. Because the next empire in this story did not merely inherit the Lydian template, it discovered what happens when the authority standing behind the coin quietly decides to put a little less silver in it. Next episode, Rome's denarius. How an empire ran on silver for 400 years, and what happened when the emperors began shaving it, 1% at a time, so slowly that nobody could name the year it broke, until a soldier's wage bought almost nothing at all. If this is the kind of history you want more of, follow the channel. 1 episode every day, and a different series for every day of the week. I am Maja. Thank you for spending the last half hour with the first coin ever struck. I will see you tomorrow in Rome.